Are you guys excited for Christmas? It's coming up. I love this time of year because all the lights and everything, and having kids just makes it even extra special this time of year. So it's super cool to be here for you guys. So we are in a season of giving. So I want to give you guys an update on our Cowboys for Kids fundraiser. So we at Lone Star do a fundraiser called Cowboys for Kids. This is our Christmas fundraiser. And so we raise money so that there's families in our community or around different organizations that we partner with, like Teen Challenge and other ones that they don't have money to provide Christmas for their children. And so we raise money here so that we can give them gift cards so that they can buy things their kids may want or need for Christmas. So this year, we have agreed to fund 382 kids for Christmas this year. Isn't that awesome? And it's been so cool because some of the families have been coming and meeting with Linda Wood, our children's director, and receiving those gifts. And it's been so neat hearing the stories that Linda has shared and how this was the hope that they were looking for as they were going into this Christmas. And so I'm so thankful that because of your giving, we have raised $56,300. Isn't that awesome? Wow. And, you know, we're going to talk a little bit later about the heart and idea of missions, but this is missions. This is us taking a step and asking God to use us in an area where we can be a blessing to other people. So I want to thank you for that. We have about 6 more kids that need to be funded for Cowboys for Kids. So if you have it on your heart to give, the way that you can do that is online through the app, or you can drop the money in a green envelope and put it in the offering baskets around the room. Speaking of giving, for those of you who are looking for your end of the year contributions, you need to get those to us postmarked if you send it by mail by December 31st. You can give online all the way up until December 31st, or you can bring it to our office all the way up until December 24th. So that would be a blessing to our church and the various different ministries that we have going on here. And lastly, we have our giving boxes around the room. If you came prepared, go ahead and give as you exit this place. That being said, the message today, the title is The King of Christmas. And we're going to be taking a look at Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. I don't know about you, but when I look at my life and I examine how God has led me through different stages, it seems that constantly it's about releasing control and not controlling every little detail that's going around me. In 2010, I went on a missions trip to Brazil. And before the missions trip, I had talked to the missionaries and we had planned out the whole trip. I was gonna fly in and I was gonna meet with them. And then they were going to connect me with some of their ministry leaders. And then at that point, I was going to go in the jungles of Brazil and be there for 6 weeks. And so I land in Brazil, I meet with the missionaries, and they proceed to tell me that I was going to be going into the jungle, not with them, but I was going to be going with some of their native local ministry directors, but they don't speak English. And I was thinking to myself, so I'm going to be in this jungle for 6 weeks with no one else that speaks English? Like, I'm going to die. This is going to be the end of my story. And so I made it through, as you can tell, but this was a precursor for a life, and as I'm sure many of you are aware, of releasing control of every little detail in our lives. If some of you guys have kids, you know that you can't control every single situation. You could teach and love on your kids as much as you can, and they'll still go punch a kid at school the next day. Releasing control is something that we need to do. So, let me pray and let's jump into this story where we're going to unpack the life of King Herod, a man who wanted to grip onto things and not release control. Lord, I just thank you for this message. I thank you that we get to come and we get to bow down before you and worship to you. Lord, I pray that as we go through this message, we will find different areas where we need to lay our crowns at your feet and release control of things that we have no business just dwelling over. Lord, I thank you in your name. And everybody says, amen. So in ancient Rome, and yes, I want to talk about Rome for a little bit because I just saw the new Gladiator movie and it inspired me to bring this in. So in ancient Rome, when a general would have a significant victory, he would have this thing called a triumph. And so what they would do is they would parade him around the city, displaying the glory that this general is receiving. They'd place a laurel crown on his head. They would take him all throughout the city and showcase to the people that this person right here, this general, has done some great feats for our emperor, and he is worthy to be celebrated. But there's one thing that's often overlooked when it comes to the general parading around the city, is that there was always a slave chained in the back of the chariot, whispering to the general, "Memento mori." Remember that you are only mortal. Memento mori. Remember that you are only mortal. The Roman general's crown was a symbol of temporary glory. He had a laurel crown, but he was in service to the emperor who had a real crown. And this slave was a constant reminder to this general saying, hey, you're getting praise and applause today, but this is only temporary because your service, just like me as a slave, is to a man, or what they thought was a god. His authority and power were fleeting, just like the crowns that we wear today. You see, each and every one of us, we have crowns, just like these, I think you guys got them, these little plastic crowns that you received when you walked into this room. Each of us have something that we're holding on to, that we're not wanting to release control to the King of Kings, the true King of Christmas. So I want to ask you, what are you holding on to? Maybe it's your success, your possessions, the work that you've built your life around. These are all good things, but they can become displays of glory that can get in the way of our relationship with the true King, Jesus. Let me ask you, what does your parade look like? This Roman general was paraded around a city, displaying the glory of Rome. But if we're honest with ourselves, we do the same thing today. Maybe it's that perfectly curated social media post. You know, there's been such a rise and epidemic of anxiety and depression, and I really believe that it stems from over excess use of social media, because we are confronted with a conflict of, hey, my friends are on here, my family's on here, and I want to show to everybody that I have the good life. I have the good life, and I'm going to display to everybody my parade of glory so that they don't think and they don't know the struggles that I'm facing on that every day, that they don't know the heartbreak that I'm facing right now. They don't know about that doctor's visit that I just had. They don't know about the loved one that just passed away. These parades can be debilitating to our walk with the true King of Christmas. So we're going to take a look at Matthew chapter 2. And this presents a dramatic clash of two kings. On one side, we see Herod, and he represents the person, us, clinging and grasping onto the control, the things in our lives that we can orchestrate and make things happen. And on the other side, we see Jesus. Jesus, who represents a different kind of kingdom, one of humility, hope, and peace. Because I don't know about you, but the many times in my life where I'm clinging on to control, trying to make things happen, I don't feel very much peace. I don't feel at peace in my heart. But when we release these crowns to Jesus, he'll bring us a peace that goes beyond any circumstance that's in our life. This passage calls us to confront the issue of who is the real king. Is it Herod? Is it us? Or is it Jesus? Is it Jesus, the one that came humbly as a baby to save us from our sins? Let's turn to Matthew chapter 2. We're going to look at verses 1 through 2, and we're going to discover together what it means to recognize and respond to the King of Christmas. Here it goes. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw this star when it rose and have come to worship him." So looking at this passage, there's some context and groundwork that we need to look at. First, we see that Matthew is showcasing that this person, this king, has been talked about from time before. We see that in Micah chapter 5, verse 2, it demonstrates God's plan for a Messiah, and it was in place long before his actual birth. We see that the story takes place in Bethlehem. Though small, this place became the birthplace of the king, whose authority is based on God's promises, not human power. We also see that Matthew confirms Jesus' lineage through the line of King David. This shows that Jesus is the fulfillment of God's promise to David, giving him the rightful place on the throne according to God's plan, not by human appointments. Jesus' kingship isn't a matter of political power or personal ambition. It is rooted in God's unchanging promises. Looking back at this election season, too many people were swayed and moved by fear. If this person doesn't get elected, everything's going to fall apart. If this person gets in office, then everything's going to be great. It's going to be good. And we need to be in the political game and vote. That's our duty as Americans. But what I saw is that too many people were swayed by temporary personal gain rather than the promises that come from the Word of God. And when we look at this story, we see that because Jesus was promised from before he was born, because there was a prophetic blessing on his life, because this was God's plan from the beginning, we can look at that and say, you know what? The things that happen on this earth, the person in political power doesn't need to sway my emotions, doesn't need to sway how I feel, because Jesus is the King of Kings. This challenges us to ask, are we focused on building our own kingdoms, or are we submitting to the eternal King who fulfills God's promises? Matthew continues, and we see how Jesus' kingship is not limited to just one people group. The Magi from the east, Caleb talked about this last week, but we see that they came from modern day Iraq or modern day Iran. And they came in fulfillment of what was talked about in Isaiah. Nations will come to your light, showing that Jesus' kingship extends to all people. Jesus is the King of nations. His reign is for all people. Yet too many times I feel like we treat it that he only belongs to, you have to look this certain way. You have to do this. The Magi's journey reminds us that Jesus invites all people from every background to worship him. So the question that each and every one of us needs to ask is, are we extending that invitation to others in our life? Are we extending that missional invitation to others, or are we only participating in the mission of God on a Sunday when we come and sit down and worship, or when we go to a small group? Or are we extending that invitation daily when we're going to our jobs, when we're in our homes? You know, one of the best places that we can extend the kingship of Jesus in our lives is how we respond to our loved ones, respond to our wife, respond to our kids. Are we willing, like the Magi, to follow God's call, even when it takes us out of our comfort zone? Even when it doesn't make sense. Because here these rulers from the east are coming to this baby and surrendering their lives to him. The Magi's declaration that they've come to worship Jesus shows us the heart of Jesus' kingship. Unlike earthly rulers who seek control, Jesus invites us to worship him freely. Their act of worship stands in contrast to Herod's need to control. Jesus' reign is about surrender, not domination. So, what are you going to surrender today? What are some crowns? As you take account of your life, as you examine, what are some things that you need to lay at the feet of Jesus? At the end of this message, there's going to be a time for you to respond to that. We're going to have our worship team up here. We're going to have people that are going to be up here to pray for you if you would like that. But it's our chance to respond to the King of Kings. Next, let's take a look at Herod. So Herod is the pretender king. And that reminds me of a situation when I was in college. So when I was in college, my brother, I have a twin brother who had just gotten a job at Kmart. Does anybody remember Kmart? Yeah? So he had just gotten a job, and then 2 weeks later, he got a call from a job that he actually wanted. So the Kmart one, as all of you guys know from back in college or that time of your life, you know, you have to do some jobs that you just got to make by until you get the real job you want. So that was for him. And so there was just a flaw in my brother's personality. At that time, he's gotten better, but at that time, he was very timid. So because he had just started this job a couple weeks ago, he didn't want to go in and he didn't want to quit when he had just gotten this job. And so he came to me to my dorm room and he said, "Tyler, I need you to do something. Can you go to Kmart pretending to be me, and can you quit my job for me?" And I said, "Absolutely." Because I knew if I was going to do this, I was going to have some fun with this. And so I go to Kmart, and they probably were like, "What is wrong with this person? Like, what happened to the Justin," that's my twin brother's name, "that was here just a couple weeks ago?" I think at one point I was like, "I think I need to go to a mental institution. I need some help." And so they did not have any issue with me leaving. Herod's story is a lot like that, but with much higher stake. In fact, he was so desperate to cling to the illusion of power, he was willing to do some crazy stuff. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 2, 3 through 8, and this is what it says. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I may go worship him as well." So when we look at Herod's life, we see that he is a puppet king. He was not in the line and the lineage of David, so he wasn't part of the Davidic kingship that the people of Israel had been promised. He lacked the legitimacy of kingship to the people of Israel. And it's because he was an Edomite, not a Jew. He was placed in power. He was placed in this position by the Roman authorities. And so for all of you Bible scholars, Bible nerds like myself, when you heard the term Edomites, you may have drawn a connection. So the tension between Herod and Edomites and Jesus stems all the way back because Herod was a descendant of Esau. Do you guys remember the story of Jacob and Esau, the brothers? And one was vying for power and control, and the other one, he was just, he'd be from California today. He liked gathering fruits and vegetables, and he was more free and fun-loving, and because of a trick he played on his brother, though, he ended up getting the birthright and the blessing to carry on the inheritance of his family. And so this vying of power and control stems all the way back to that, because here Herod, a descendant of Esau, and Jesus, a descendant of Jacob through the line of David, are now at odds once again together. And this represents Esau's family line, generation, a rejection of God's covenant promise, while Jacob and Jesus is a fulfillment of God's promises. So Herod, he had a lot of things to be insecure about. Here he was in a place where he probably shouldn't have been. He was appointed. His father and grandfather did some shady stuff and supported Julius Caesar. So he was able to get into this position, and he was always wondering who's going to stab him in the back, who's going to betray him. And this led to fear and insecurity. Fear and insecurity. As a parent, or even just going through life, a lot of times my desire to control something, to control a situation, to control how my son responded to something, stems from fear and insecurity. Like when my son does something, I'm like, I want him to not do that so that he could grow up and do well and be successful. And I start having these fearful doubts and things that come into my mind because I want what's best, but there's a fear that's guiding me. Insecurity. Maybe just like Herod felt insecure because he shouldn't have been in that position. Maybe there's areas in my life and in your life where insecurity has allowed itself to cause us to need to control everything. And here's the thing, this fear and insecurity, it doesn't just stay with us. It doesn't just stop there, but it has a ripple effect to those around us. We see that Herod's fear didn't stay with him, but it spread throughout Jerusalem. And why was Jerusalem fearful? Because they knew, because of his fear, because of his insecurity, he did some crazy stuff. He got his wife and a couple of his sons killed because he thought that they were plotting against him and trying to overthrow his reign. This fear of losing control led him to extreme acts of violence. And we would see that continued through the massacre of the children in Bethlehem. Another thing that we see in the life of Herod is a sense of false worship. What does he tell the Magi? Hey, you go and find Jesus, or the Messiah, and then come back to me, and then tell me about him so that I can go and worship him. so that I can give him glory and honor. As we know, that was a lie. Herod didn't want to worship Jesus. He wanted to kill him to preserve his power. You know, there's some historical irony to this, and I think it's so applicable to our lives. Herod spent his life building grand structures like the temple. So the temple that the Israelites went to worship God, Yahweh, Herod rebuilt it for the people so that he could stay in power and he could appease the Jewish people because he knew he wasn't a Jew, so he needed to do everything he could to control the situation. He built these grand structures to hold on to this power, yet the very structure he built, the temple, a symbol of worship to God, was something that he did not make a part of his everyday life. He did not worship the true King of Kings. And it was because his life was filled with pride and fear. Building these grand structures was a way for him to gain the respect and the admiration from the people around him. Yet, really, it wasn't about worship, it was about self-preservation. And you know, how many times have I done this? How many times have I done this where I've put a mask up of, I'm going to seek the king, but really it was because I didn't want to let someone down around me. I'm going to do everything I can for God, but really within my heart, I knew that there was some pride and there was some insecurity that was causing me to do what I was doing for the king. Herod's life teaches us the dangers of holding on to control. But Jesus brings us to a different story. He calls us to surrender control and trust him. So I want to give you guys a couple ways that you guys can do that. First is release control, surrender control in the area of your marriage, of your family. I think too many times some of the heartbreak and hurt that we face is in our marriages and our families is we're trying to control every aspect of the people around us. And that goes from kids to parents too. You know, when you're trying to control the narrative so your parents don't find out what you did, that only leads to heartbreak and pain. Another area we can release control is in our work and our leadership. You know, some of you have been placed in authority and leadership. So rather than maybe micromanaging or maybe trying to make sure everything's happening in a certain way because of fear and insecurity, maybe release that to Jesus, because when you do that, your life's not going to be as stressful. It's not going to weigh on you as much. The next thing is finances and recognition. Are we relying on our money and our status more than we are relying on the guiding of Jesus? Jesus calls us to surrender our need for control. So how do we do that? Let's look at the life of the Magi, and that can help us unpack how to do that. God doesn't want something from us. He simply wants us. That's from C.S. Lewis. This shows the heart of worship. This isn't transactional, but relational. And this is how we respond to the area of control in our life. Let's read Matthew chapter 2, verses 9 through 12. After they had heard the king, they went on their way. And the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by a different route. In this story, we see that divine guidance led these Magi to Jesus. They followed a star, and this star wasn't a natural occurrence, but it was a divine means that led them to the king. Such as many times throughout the Old Testament, you see the pillar of fire and the cloud leading the nation of Israel. And so what are some things in our lives that we need to be attuned to in the guiding of that God is guiding in our lives? Another thing we see here is they brought gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Each gift symbolizing something profound about who Jesus was. Gold represents his kingship. Frankincense represents his divinity. And myrrh represents his sacrifice, foreshadowing the death that Jesus was going to have to endure for each and every one of us. Another thing that we see here that the Magi do that I think is so important for us to remember is they continue to worship Jesus by their obedience. So they worship Jesus. In the back of their minds, they're thinking, hey, Herod said he wanted us to come back and report what we had heard and what we had seen to him so that he can go worship him. And they're like, well, but in our dream, we were told to go a different way. Well, but he's the king. Like, shouldn't we listen to him? Like, maybe we were hearing stuff in our dream. Maybe we all just drank something that caused us to have the same dream. So what did they do? In their obedience, they listened to God and they went a different route. Worship isn't just about what we do in the moment of praise. It's not just about this moment in this room right here, but it's about how we live our lives. It's about what we do in the everyday. It's that daily surrender and daily coming back to the Father in obedience to him. Because it didn't make sense for them to go a different way. They probably could have got more power and prestige by going to Herod, but they decided to go a different way because they were following the king. How many times in our lives do we do the opposite? Where we're like, I should do something else. I shouldn't listen to that person, but they have a lot of power over me, or I should do this instead of this, but what if that person thinks of me differently? True worship leads to a life of obedience. So, how do we respond to this? Do we respond like Herod? With paranoia and fear, constantly wondering, is someone going to stab us in the back? I need to hold on to this control. Or do we respond like the Magi? That in their worship of the king, in their seeking the king, they embarked on a journey, a spiritual journey, where they met the king, responded to him, and listened in obedience. And not only that, but they had an opportunity to have joyful worship at the feet of the king. Every person in this room, me included, must decide who will sit on the throne of their lives, themselves or Jesus. You know, in thinking about this can sound very daunting, right? The idea of surrendering control to the king. And I was reminded that it just takes steps. In our spiritual journey that we have with God, it's just taking one step in the direction of Jesus that leads us to him. So a couple weeks ago, Hudson, my son, told me that he's 6 years old. He told me that he accepted Jesus into his heart. And so he was like up in his room and he prayed and asked Jesus to come in his heart. And so a couple weeks had gone by and I wanted to ask him if he really meant that or if he was still a Christian, because a couple days later he had punched a kid. So I was like, well, I want to make sure that this is real. So I was like, Hudson, do you have Jesus in your heart? Do you love Jesus? And he goes, yes, but big Jesus isn't in my heart. Baby Jesus is in my heart. I'm like, what? You're a little off on how that works, but I didn't say that. And as I was thinking about that, I was like, what does that mean? And he proceeded to tell me that I'm little and baby Jesus is inside of me. And as I grow, Jesus will grow within me. And I don't know about you, but how true is that when it comes to releasing control? It may seem daunting. It may seem difficult. It may say, how do I do that? How do I surrender control and admiration to the King of Kings? But it's just like doing what my son said. Christ's reign grows within us as we surrender more of ourselves to him. So think back to that Roman general going through the town, receiving glory, a temporary glory, and yet behind him a slave bound by chains whispers, "You're only mortal. This is fleeting." Thankfully, when we look to Christmas, rather than a slave standing behind us whispering, "You are mortal," there's something else that's whispering to us. "Behold, your king is here. Remember that you are loved. Loved by the king who traded his throne for a manger. Loved by a savior who traded his crown of glory for a crown of thorns. Loved by the one who invites you to lay down your fleeting crown to take up something eternal." So as we close today, I want to challenge you. What crown are you holding on to? And what crown do you need to lay at the feet of Jesus? And for the next few moments, the band's going to sing a couple of worship songs. And there's going to be people up here that can pray with you if you so desire. But let's worship the King. So if everybody, you could stand up to your feet. Let's worship and surrender to the King of Kings today.